Hi everyone, it's Dr. E and I'm here to deliver the week 6. Are we in week 6? I think so. Week 6 supplemental video. You're probably feeling like I am, kind of a little out of sorts sometimes. So what I'm going to talk about today are some of the things that we addressed last week in our readings. So the Victorian era, and I'll talk just briefly about Lord Tennyson's Lady of Shalott. So I'm just going to pull things up and dive right in, okay? So this is Queen Victoria, right? Because it's pretty important to kind of recognize that this is an era named after a specific person, right? We move from the Romantic period, which is more about a genre, into an era that's defined at least by the life and time and rule of Queen Victoria, right? So Victoria didn't live in these specific years, right? But this is kind of the era in terms of thinking about literature and the time period in general, from 1830 to 1901. So by the turn of the century, when we move from the 19th century to 20th century, we will also, Queen Victoria passes away and will be then thrust into more modern contemporary times, obviously named after Queen Victoria. This is important to think about just because we noted in the Romantic period that the times were kind of volatile, right? France was, going through the revolution, and there started to become this kind of industrial era in England, right? So instead of kind of having the townships and villages, we start to kind of see more of the cities popping up. Certainly not all cities that were the size of London. London grows exponentially during the Victorian era, but we start to see even more industrialization, so that changes the landscape even more. You have those smokestacks and things that are really reminiscent of something that's more like a city environment, right? So London replaces Paris as the center of influence. Remember, Paris, is supposed to be the height of art and literature and even ideologies, right? But Paris starts to kind of fall back, especially after the French Revolution, and London starts to become a banking center. And we have the onset of colonialism in the British Empire. So this map really gives us a sense of scale, right? So think of the size of England. England is right here, and this is, the United Kingdom, right? So we have England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland in this tiny little area, these little islands, and you'll see that the influence spreads. We have all of Canada under British rule. We have some countries in Africa that are under British rule, even in South America. Of course, India becomes a colonized space, as well as some islands here, but also, of course, Australia, New Zealand. New Zealand's off the coast here. This is just to make clear that, England isn't the biggest country, but they have so much influence, and they start to spread out because they are seeking different territories, right, for what those territories can produce in terms of crops. So think about things like tea and sugar, a lot of sugar plantations in the islands around North and South America. So we start to get even more into this notion of enslaved peoples, right? And England will come, they will have their reckoning before the US, but we're still talking about their influence is so wide and broad, and that starts to impact the globe. Okay, so I want you to really, when we're thinking about colonization, think of India. India is a great example because the British go in and they essentially take India as a culture and force those folks living in India, which various languages, various cultures, various regions, different religions, and enforce their own kind of British ideologies on them. So they enforce English as the language, right? Which you'll see the after effects of today. A lot of folks in India know English and have gone through the educational system that was established by the British, right? So, think about what it takes to colonize another space, to go in and say, here's your new language, here's your new educational system, that, religion, no, you can't practice that anymore, you have to follow our beliefs. It's demoralizing in a lot of ways to peoples who, their previous lives and their previous belief systems have essentially been erased, or at least on the surface have been erased, right? So we deal with the after effects of this long into, and we'll see this into the 20th and 21st century. But it's brutal. Colonization is not something that happens without bloodshed, without resistance, right? You have people in all of these different spaces on the map resisting the control of the British, because it's not like the British discovered these places. They already existed. They already had, thriving cultures and peoples, but the British wanted to have, the access to these different crops and these different resources that were very valuable. And that put England on the map in terms of control, right? But again, just thinking about the scale, right? If we look at this map, this is Great Britain, and look at all of the places that they colonized. It takes so much effort and money and time and just resources to go into the colonization, but England did it. And of course, their power and influence doesn't last, but during this time period, it's just out of control. It's amazing in kind of a horrible way. So if we think about the Victorian Age, it's really marked by these ideas of morality, right? And domestic propriety and earnestness, right? This is mentioned by our editors. And this is just to mean that we even use the term Victorian now to kind of talk about these very prim and proper expectations that are placed on women usually, but men as well. Women had lace collars up to their necks, right? They did not show any ankle even in their outfits. Of course, we're talking about mostly middle class white women at this time, but the expectations were far and wide in terms of that notion of women don't push back against the men in society. Women don't inherit any property, right? So the Victorian era, even though there is a female ruler at this time, women don't necessarily see a lot of advancements, right? And certainly when we're thinking about African folks, right, at this time living in England, or any peoples of color, including women who, are also women of color, they have no rights compared to even white women, but certainly not to men who have influence and land, right? So at this time in England, up until this time, it's only white men who were landowning or wealthy, and the only way to have wealth at this time is essentially to own land. Those are the only people who had rights in terms of voting or making any decisions in Parliament, right? Crazy times, but things change, right? So thumbs up to the fact that things will eventually change. So we have, these expectations when it comes to the Victorian era. But then we start to see some changes, just like I said, in industrialization. Transportation, which started kind of growing in the Romantic era, really hits a fast pace now. So we have steam-powered railway lines, and Liverpool and Manchester become really important because these are spaces where those towns become built up into industrial cities. They're ports, so they have supplies, crops, everything from all the colonized places coming in to those areas. And the only way to transport them up until now has been essentially like horse-drawn buggy and things. But then we really have the train system that develops in England that lasts even to this day. There's a lot of ways to get around England on train. Okay, so we have those changes. And then we also have, so you see that we have, 1830 to 1848, and then we also have some government changing in that same period. So the Reform Bill of 1832 is pretty important because it extends voting rights, right? So though not to all, peoples, but to working class white men. So no longer do people have to be wealthy and affluent and pretty much land owning at this time. But of course, white women definitely don't have these rights, and all peoples of color don't have these rights. So it's a slow trudge to get to where everybody has access to those voting rights. The time of troubles develops, and this is because you can't have all this growth without potentially having some drawbacks. You can't have people flooding into these different industrialized cities without some problems associated with that. But we also have some issues with bad farm and crop harvest. So there's an economic downturn because there's so much growth, right? And then these times of troubles lead to really awful, awful conditions for the people working in these factories. So working conditions become extreme in the mines and factories because, again, we're working with a laissez-faire kind of mentality of no regulation, because regulation means time, it means money for these people who are owning these businesses and spaces. But that means that the working conditions are just awful. And we don't have any kinds of limits on child labor. So you have children and women working deep in the mines, getting sick, living in really horrendous conditions. A lot of illnesses are, just passed around because people are crammed into these spaces. Because a lot of times when you worked at a factory, you worked in the housing supplied by that business. So they were taking money from your wages for your living conditions and sometimes food. People were making, next to nothing. And these companies didn't have a need to really provide really nice living quarters. No, they provided the minimum, the bare minimum for the people who worked there. Okay. So awful, awful working conditions. That's, in the time of troubles. And the working class, according to our editors, right? Workers and their families in the slums of like Manchester just lived in crowded, unsanitary housing. The conditions under which men, women, and children toiled in mines and factories were just brutal, unimaginably brutal. I'm going to stop right here and just say the random word for the supplemental video, which is going to be cat. Okay. So going back to the mid-Victorian period, because the Victorian era is pretty long, so it's broken up into early, mid, and late. Free trade brings an economic turn. So there's some shift. After about 1848, the time of troubles kind of works. Things start to get a little bit better in terms of the economy. Colonialism and expansion is sold, I'm telling Queen Victoria sold this idea as one to protect the poor natives and advance civilization. Deep side eye to that, because you don't go take over people and places because you're trying to help them and you're so giving and generous. It's to take over and benefit economically from those people and to enforce your ideologies on them. Queen Victoria. And then we have these religion and science that kind of start to butt heads, right? So you have the Church of England that has a lot of influence, and we see the church even broken down into different kind of, I wouldn't say they're sects necessarily, but you have the high church, the mid church, but then science comes in because there's a butting of heads there between people who are really dismissive of religion and think that science is the only way to think, right? So you have a lot of literature that comes out of the time period that reflects some of that tension, okay? And then you have the late period. There is prosperity because, of course, colonizing means that, England's going to benefit from that. But you do then have difficulties. You have rebellion. People are not just taking, this colonization idea lying down. There's war, there's massacres. People are resisting. Home rule for Ireland becomes, a sticking point because Ireland is a separate place. It's a separate culture. It's a separate language. They speak English, right? But they, originally are speaking Irish or Gaelic, right? Home rule so that people in Ireland cannot bow down to the Queen at this time. So there's that conversation. The post-war US becomes competition. So the colonies, of course, the former colonies, now the United States, because of slavery, again, starts to be competitive because there are, crops that are sought after that people around the globe want from the US. And then there's that movement away from the more Victorian literature into more conversations about politics, okay? And so what we see in Lord Tennyson is kind of a pushback to this time period in the Victorian era and kind of one that reflects back on the Romantic era, because the Romantic era, the genre was about, damsels in distress and knights at the round table. And we definitely see that with the Lady of Shalott, right? Because it's about this lady who, lusts after Lancelot, and because of that, she dies. women dying for men. Don't get me started. Always popular in literature. So that's it for now. And just if you have any questions about what you read previously, just let me know.